And I think if we just kind of step back and say, well, like, what is my goal in all of this? Like, what is the point of asking these questions about religion or morality or politics or epistemology or whatever? It's because we want to know the truth about these things. And philosophy, the truth, it's hard. And I think that can be discouraging and make it difficult and make us kind of like lose our focus and think about other things. And so I think it's really important that we kind of come back to that goal.
Welcome everyone to today's AMA, where we are very pleased to welcome Professor Liz Jackson. She is assistant professor at Ryerson University, received a PhD in philosophy from Notre Dame. Her primary philosophical interests are in epistemology, decision theory, intentionality, philosophy of religion, and various intersections of these fields. She has a variety of published papers exploring these topics. More of her content can be found on her website, liz-jackson.com, or her YouTube channel, which I'll provide links for these in the description as well. And feel free to add anything to that, but with that, welcome Professor Liz Jackson.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm super pumped to be here. And yeah, I mean, I think you basically covered the important bases. So yeah, sounds great.
Awesome. So I think one thing that a lot of people are going to be interested in relating to your work is some of your stuff on Pascal's wager. Arguably, it's kind of a flashy thing in a way, as far as philosophy goes. And so I actually want to start it off with bring up a potential criticism and get some of your thoughts on that. So people have brought up the criticism that, well, when you bring in infinite utilities into decision theory problems, you can get some, at best, surprising results, at worst, maybe absurd ones. And you've talked about how to deal with denying the absorption property, but there are other problems that can come up. So I wanted to present this problem by presenting another decision problem, sort of briefly, and sort of showing that there's another problem that seems to arise. So that seems to cast doubt on the claim that the infinite always trumps the finite. So here's the problem. Maybe I should have written it down, but we're considering there's two different acts, Act 1 and Act 2, and there's two different sort of states in the world, and state 1 and state 2, and we can suppose that they're causally and evidentially independent. And if you perform Act 1 and the world is in state 1, you get infinite utility. If you perform Act 1 and the world is in state 2, you get a negative utility that's finite, but a very negative utility. I suppose. And if you perform Act 2 and the world is in state 1, you get, say, a very positive but finite utility. And if you perform Act 2 and the world is in state 2, you get also a very positive but finite utility. And suppose you also believe that the world is overwhelmingly likely to be in state 2. So the state 2 is the one where if you're performing Act 1, you get a very negative but finite utility. And if the world is and if you perform Act 2, you get very positive but finite utility. If you apply the basic decision theory, the first act will have an infinite utility because of the infinite in the first state. And if you take the second act, it has a very large but still finite utility. And so rationality will seem to prefer Act 1, but plausibly, I don't know, it seems that Act 2 seems much more attractive. I've maybe been clear in sort of stating the problem, and maybe you could comment on it if you'd like.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So no, nice question. In my opinion, I think this is probably the best objection to my wager. And this is actually one of the first times I've been asked it in context like this. So great question. And let me also say, I mean, yeah, I think like you can even think about it maybe slightly more concretely. It's like, what if you're given the choice between like being, so let's see how I can put this. I also like didn't come prepared with this. So a 0.000001 chance at a 0.00001 increase, per day in utility for all infinity, and you can have that. But the cost of that is like you're tortured for 100 trillion years or something, right? So you can either take those two things together, or like say like just do nothing, right? It seems very counterintuitive to say, yeah, it's worth being tortured for 100 trillion years to get this tiny chance at this tiny increase in infinite utility, but it is infinite, right? And so this is I think, yeah, the best objection to this idea that infinites always trump finites. So yeah, I mean, in terms of like, and I say too, like I defend Pascal's wager, but there are some objections I'm worried about. This is, again, probably the biggest objection I'm worried about. And I think, I mean, there are some, so there's basically two ways to go in terms of responding to this. Way one is to just bite the bullet and try to argue that infinites do always trump finites. Way two is to say, let's restrict that a little bit. Let's say that infinites trump finites, but maybe not in every case, and then try to give some principles that would rule out these kinds of cases, but still allow us to get at least certain versions of Pascal's wager going. And then I guess there's always way three, which is just going in for, a finite version of the wager and kind of avoiding a lot of these problems. And, I'm open to doing that as well. I'm not, my version of the wager does involve infinities, because I think you can get some kind of more interesting, stronger claims in some realms. But yeah, like I'm open to maybe weakening some of those and going in for kind of a finite version of the wager. So I think that's kind of one way to get around some of these problems. And, there are other benefits of going that way as well, I guess, too. It kind of helps with Pascal's mugging, arguably, and some other problems that, infinities just kind of notoriously cause a lot of different problems in decision theory, including like the St. Petersburg paradox and others as well. So that's kind of way one you could go. So then maybe I'll take that in reverse order. Then the second thing I mentioned is maybe trying to restrict Pascal's wager in some sense to get it so that these kinds of decisions we could say that though if you shouldn't choose the small chance at infinity when there's this huge finite cost, but maybe we could still get some versions of Pascal's wager off the ground, even infinite ones that are consistent with that. And so on this way of going, maybe what you could say is, well, you shouldn't wager on God unless your credence at least reaches some threshold, right? So, and maybe that wouldn't fully solve the problem, but then at least we could say, if you think that the chance of you getting this infinite good is just astronomically small, we could at least say, like, in those cases, you shouldn't take the bet. But if you think there's like a reasonable chance at getting this infinite good, then maybe you should pay some finite cost to get it. And then we can kind of say the same thing about Pascal's wager. Yeah, we couldn't get the result that if your credence that God exists, that Christianity is true, is like astronomically low, then we couldn't get the result that you should wager. But maybe that's okay. Maybe we could still get the result that people, I think there's like a 30 or 40 or 50% chance that God exists or that a certain religion is true, they should wager. So that's kind of another way of going, and I'm not sure if I'm like totally happy with any of these ways of going. Okay, here's a third way of going, which is like the totally extreme kind of bullet biting way. And that would be to say, like, try to get an error theory for kind of our intuitions about this. And look, there is a lot of psychological evidence that we're extremely bad at reasoning with very large numbers. They actually did this really interesting study where they had people, so they said, how much money would you pay to save like 100,000 birds? And then people were like, the average answer was like $20-something. And then how much money would you pay to save like 1 million birds? How much money would you pay to save like, 2 million birds? I forget, it was these three very large numbers. I probably have the numbers wrong. But in each case, people would pay about $20 to save that many birds. And so the thought is like when these numbers get really, really big, we don't do a good job reasoning with them. We kind of just like classify them in our minds as a very big thing. And it's hard for us to really do value comparisons with those, especially when we're talking about then like finite numbers that we can reason about better. And so I think this response would say like, look, like, yeah, you should always go for the infinite expected value over the finite thing, even if there's a serious cost. And that seems counterintuitive, but it's because we're just really, really bad at reasoning about infinities. And this kind of gives us a strong reason to sort of distrust our intuition. So yes, it's counterintuitive, but you should take the small chance at getting the infinite good, even if it means paying some very, very significant finite cost. So not totally happy with that either. Again, like I said, this is one of the biggest things I'm worried about, just to kind of, be upfront and honest about that. But yeah, those are some ways you could maybe begin to start to answer it.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks. That's really helpful. I mean, does it make sense to sort of classify the potential responses into three basic categories? One is to say, well, we have this apparent problem, but the problem's only apparent. Our intuitions are leading us astray, and that really the infinities do trump. That maybe that's one response. Another is to say something's wrong with our decision theory. We have to amend it in this way or that way, so that we can accommodate these issues and give the expected result. And another is to say that some of the inputs we were making, right, regarding credences or preference or something, were wrong, or we had some assumption about them that was wrong, and so we should dispense of those. For example, not use infinities in decision problems like this. And so, like, those are the basic categories.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I'm kind of open to any of those, but arguably they all kind of have their downsides as well. Maybe the one where you don't put infinities in at all maybe has the least bullets to bite. It's just going to be a weaker argument. So that seems like an upside of that one to me. I think the other two have some kind of bullet to bite. I don't know. So yeah, that's a helpful way of categorizing it, I think.
Awesome. Yeah, and the finite version of Pascal's wager could still be a very good argument, in that a huge, even if still finite, utility might still compel belief or the cultivation of belief, so long as your credence in the proposition isn't overwhelmingly small. Right.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, you could even say it's like indefinitely large or something, and then try to get something going there that would like swamp at least most really small credences. So yeah, I think that's an interesting way of going. I guess part of the reason we didn't necessarily immediately want to go that way is I think a lot of people just give up on infinities really quickly, and we're like thinking, well, if we treat it like a limit and kind of pay attention to some of the way that mathematicians have dealt with infinities, we can kind of maybe get some interesting results here. But like, I don't know, in that paper, Salvaging Pascal's Wager, we kind of propose a certain formal framework. I don't necessarily think that formal framework is going to deal with all the problems. And so I'm really open to the idea of moving to finite utilities as well.
Great. Let's see, where did I want to go next? So actually, you have another paper. I assume we'll come back to Pascal's wager, and actually my next question is still relevant to it anyway. So you have another paper from 2016 where you discuss Schellenberg's argument from divine hiddenness, and you essentially use Pascal type reasoning in order to at least undercut some of the motivation for that argument, or the strength of the argument, by saying that, well, a lot of people in fact face this sort of decision problem, and if they're not doing the decision theoretically optimal action, that is cultivating theistic belief, they're in a sense being resistant and are kind of blameworthy for that in some sort of practical way. and so don't really count as non-resistant non-believers, or at least many of them don't. And that's sort of the point of the argument that you're making.
Yeah.
So I thought when reading this of two like potential lines of pushback. One is that something that you somewhat addressed, but I guess we'll get to that. One is that, well, how many people really face this sort of problem, right? Because to face a decision problem like this, you have to have the relevant credences and preferences that generate it. And arguably not a lot of people, especially non-believers, have those sorts of credences. So what do you think about this potential response?
Yeah, so maybe I just want to hear maybe a little more about why you think people don't have the relevant credences and preferences. I mean, maybe that so maybe there's a specific one you're thinking of, but I'll just say a little bit like, for non-believers, like, yeah, sure, you might be an atheist, and believe that there is no God, but a lot of my work, I also, talk about the difference between someone's belief and then their credence, and, I know you're familiar with that distinction, but the idea is that you could believe there's no God, but that doesn't necessarily mean you would assign that a credence of 0. And in fact, according to sort of the commonly posited constraints on rational credences, that isn't the sort of thing you should assign a credence of 0 to, because it's not like a contradiction. And there's a lot of disagreement from smart people about that too. I think that's not totally insignificant either. So look, I'm not saying you need to assign it like a 0.5 credence or something, but I just think, I guess it's kind of an empirical question. Like, do most atheists really assign, that God exists or a certain religion? Do they really assign it credence 0? And that might be something we need to kind of go out and do studies on, I guess. But in my opinion, it doesn't seem to me like a lot of atheists would say that it's totally epistemically impossible that God exists. Maybe it's extremely unlikely, and they think the evidence is sufficient to establish or to make it rational, I guess, for them to disbelieve that God exists. But that's, again, very different than giving it a credence of 0. The preference thing is interesting, because I guess it depends on, it could depend on how you frame the problem. There might be people that say, oh, there's all this evil in the world. If there was a heaven, I wouldn't want to go there or be united with God. And so I guess I get that point of view, but I also think, heaven is supposed to be this place where your desires are met. And so again, it's kind of an empirical question, I guess, to an extent. Like, would atheists want to go to heaven if heaven exists? I'd maybe be interested to hear people's opinions on that, but it's supposed to be a place, like, it's kind of just like stipulated as part of heaven that it's like a really great place for the people there, and they really enjoy it. And I don't even know if it makes sense to say you're like in heaven and you're miserable, just sort of given the theological doctrines. So I don't know, were those kind of the credences and preferences you were thinking about, or was it something else?
Yeah, well, sure. So I can give like a particular example that
sure.
I guess I'm somewhat sympathetic to, of a sort of reason one might not have that sort of preference. A person might not want to live forever. They might find the prospect horrifying in a way. Maybe there's something irrational about that, or maybe they would be better off in some respect if they weren't to have that preference. But I think a fair amount of people, I guess this is also an empirical question, but a fair amount of people have, I think, those sorts of worries. So is that something that could be maybe something taken seriously, or?
No, I think that's actually just there's some literature on this. I know John Martin Fisher's written some on it. It's super interesting kind of question. And it's actually like related to some stuff in economics too, about like kind of time bias, and, is it okay to have different preferences about the near future than the far future? So I will say we kind of address like at least kind of this objection from a more economics point of view in the paper called Salvaging Pascal's Wager. And we just kind of try to motivate this idea that, so we talk about two different kinds of functions. One is a function where you're just like, you drop off at a certain point. So like you only care about like the next 10,000 years and then you just don't care at all. And we try to kind of motivate that might be irrational. Like if I tell you 10,001 years from now, you're going to be tortured forever. But if you give me $1, you won't be. It's like, it seems a little bit weird to be like, no, I just don't care. I'm not giving you any money to prevent being tortured. And so then the other possibility is that you care about the far future, but you just care about it less. I mean, and then I guess how this will work out will actually sort of depend on some of the stuff we were just talking about with like the infinite versus the finite utilities. But I think as long as you kind of have infinite utilities in there, as long as you care about the far future, even if it's just less, you should still care about heaven. And then if they're finite utilities, you'll need to care, I guess, like to a certain extent. But we could, again, like we were talking about, kind of make the finite numbers quite large. So the math works out. So that's kind of answering it from a more kind of economics-y way. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I guess another thing to note too, I guess here is part of this is, again, like an empirical question, like, do people actually have this preference? Because I also know a lot of people that I think have the opposite thing, where they're just like really freaked out about death and ceasing to exist, and they would love to live forever. And part of the paper is like, look, people do face this sort of problem. And so then that's, we've kind of been, I guess, moving in between talking about the actual psychological states of people and then talking about like maybe stuff more about rationality, right? But part of like what's at issue here, I think, is the psychological states of people, and how many people have this preference of not living forever. Because I do think too, another thing to just note about that paper, which you did note, is that my aims in there are modest, in the sense that I'm not trying to argue there's no non-resistant non-believers. And I'm just trying to say, here's a reason to think there might be less than we would have thought of otherwise. It's because we don't only have to do like our epistemic duties with respect to the question of God's existence. We also have to take into account these practical duties. So, what I say in the paper is consistent with some people not wanting to live forever and some people assigning God's existence a credence of 0. But, again, it's kind of an empirical question. If that's like a super, super common thing, yeah, I think that would potentially be a problem for my argument.
Yeah, that makes sense. So like, even if you could you may not want to, but you could just grant for the sake of the paper that, okay, there really are not a lot of people that face this decision problem or maybe less than you might expect, or just might not be everybody, but still there's some, perhaps a lot. And that's at least some evidence against that sort of argument. The strength of that, how much it undercuts it, might depend on various empirical factors, as you point out.
Yeah, totally agree with that.
Awesome. So a second sort of criticism that I thought someone might have on this line of argument is actually related to another paper you've written, I guess somewhat, maybe tangentially, in that you seem to be arguing that if the person isn't performing what's decision theoretically optimal, then they're in some sense blameworthy for not doing so. But might we not think that we can be a little bit more permissive maybe in what we're blameworthy or not blameworthy for doing or not doing, in that, okay, sometimes we're not blameworthy for failing to do what's strictly decision theoretically optimal. And maybe this is one of those cases. So maybe there are cases where people in fact are facing this sort of decision problem. They have the sort of credences and preferences that would generate the problem, but aren't blameworthy for failing to act on it. I mean, maybe could you comment on that briefly?
Yeah, nice question. No, I like that. And it's true too that there's a lot of evidence that we fail in systematic ways to act in decision theoretically optimal ways, and so there'd be a lot of blameworthiness if we were going in for this general principle that in every case where you don't do what's decision theoretically optimal, we can blame you. So yeah, I think I think it's a good point, and I think I agree, especially like in hard cases or cases where what is decision theoretically optimal might just be difficult to see. Yeah, that I think we can't, I probably don't want to have to rely, if my argument relies on a principle that they're always blameworthy, then that's not a good thing. And so I think, maybe I could have said more about this in the paper. I think in the last section I talked about it a little bit. But I think, the extent to which we're sort of blameworthy in these cases, I think does kind of depend on what's at stake. And so maybe in really low stakes cases, maybe you're like deciding what to eat for breakfast and one is like slightly more decision theoretically optimal or whatever. But the stakes are just so low, like whether you eat eggs or eat a donut, it's like not that big of a deal, and maybe you're not blameworthy. And so then the thought is that even if that's right, when the stakes are like super, super high, we need to really kind of sit down and think through what we're doing. And like, if there's like a lot you could lose in a certain situation, I think you need to you have a duty to think harder about it and maybe to really try to do the right thing. And so I would argue, like, look, in the case of religion, for example, the stakes are arguably infinitely high. And so then I think as the stakes get higher, our duties to sort of act prudentially in a prudentially rational way are higher. We have more of those duties as well. I do think things kind of get interesting here, and things maybe I could have considered more in the paper and didn't. Like, does blame come in degrees? Maybe we could be more or less blameworthy, and like, how does that? I mean, that's actually potentially an issue with like the divine hiddenness literature in general too. Like, how does that interact with, this idea that you're just like a flat out non-resistant non-believer or resistant non-believer? Like, do you have to like meet some kind of threshold of blame? So I think there's probably a lot of kind of interesting and maybe underexplored questions, like how blameworthy do you have to be? What do we do with the idea that seems to come in degrees? But the thought is that maybe if you're not decision theory, you're not doing what's decision theoretically optimal, that doesn't always result in blame. The thought is that it generally results in more blame when the stakes are higher. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's obviously more to explore there, but yeah, I remember you discussed that briefly in the paper. That's great.
Yeah.
I guess just a clarifying thing, I forget if you make it explicit in the paper, but when we talk about blameworthiness here, is it necessarily some sort of moral notion, or is it sort of rational blameworthiness, or is it maybe there's no distinction there?
No, that's a super interesting question. I this is something I would love to think about more, because it does kind of seem like, well, we can kind of at least intuitively carve apart two different notions. I mean, one is this notion of like doing what you morally ought to do, and you're blameworthy if you like murder people and rape people and all of that, right? Like, I think most of us have a good sense of that. But there's kind of another potentially separable, but I think really interesting kind of blameworthiness, where someone says like they clearly have this goal and they've made it clear that's their goal and that is their goal, but they're not taking the means to that goal in a very clear way, and in a way that they see, they even acknowledge and recognize. I mean, I have a friend, not going to tell you all the details of that, but she's in this situation right now, and me and my other friend are just like, what are you doing? This is like so frustrating. And maybe I'll think of a more concrete example, like someone who refuses to save for retirement or something, or someone who really wants to get healthy but just won't go to the gym. You could even think about maybe weakness of will cases might kind of fit in this category very well. And maybe you could argue, yeah, that is actually moral because you're violating a duty to yourself. That's interesting. So maybe it is a kind of moral blameworthiness, but it's in regard to the duties that you have to yourself. But if we don't want to say that, there might be this other kind of blameworthiness that's sort of like a prudential blameworthiness. You're not, you're not failing to meet any moral goals. You're just not acting rationally by your own lights. So, I think that's an interesting thing to think about in the context of the divine hiddenness literature too, because again, we have this concept of non-resistant non-believers. What kind of blame is in question there? Maybe he is thinking about moral blame, and if that's right, then maybe I'll need to try to go in for this. You're not, you're violating a duty to yourself kind of thing. But if we're more open about what in the different ways that you could be resistant, maybe The problem is that you're not, you're not being rational by your own lights. You're not doing what you ought to do, sort of given some goal you have. So yeah, I think there's a ton of really interesting stuff to explore there.
Yeah, I think I absolutely agree. I mean, it seems like there is a sense in which the person who, by their own lights, isn't doing what would work to satisfy their own desires or commitments that they have. There's something irrational, perhaps worth being called blameworthy there. If maybe we should call it moral, but maybe not. Doesn't really. That's a whole separate topic. I guess one more question related to that divine hiddenness, and then move on. As you discuss in the outset of the paper, well, your conclusion is relatively modest. But what if someone says that, okay, even one non-resistant non-believer is enough to sort of count as pretty strong evidence in favor of the non-existence of God? And so unless this gives us a reason to think that there isn't any, it's not really doing much to counteract the argument. What do you think about this?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. It's an interesting question, because I do think Schellenberg kind of has this view. I think it's like as long as there's like one person, and it's interesting too, because you can even think about like each individual's life, and it's like one person for even like one period of their life, even for one small amount of time, is like, and so I guess yeah, it's interesting to think about that. And so I guess what I would say in response to that is, I do think, I mean, look, evidence comes in degrees, right? There's more or less strong evidence against God's existence, and intuitively, to me, the more non-resistant non-believers there are, the more that should lower someone's credence that God exists without, some kind of other maybe explanation, or defense, greater good defense, or whatever of that. And so maybe one would count as some kind of evidence, but in the same way that like a perfect world with like one evil thing doesn't seem to me to be as bad of a problem of people as a world where there's like a Holocaust every single day. In the same way, like, look, maybe we would be like, why did that one thing happen? But I think it's a lot easier in the first world to give some kind of greater good defense, or maybe even some kind of skeptical theism. There might be reason for this, even if we don't know what it is. Whereas if there's like a Holocaust every day, it's like it's just such stronger evidence against an all-powerful, all-good being. And so I think we would do well to view the divine hiddenness problem in a similar way. Yeah, one non-resistant non-believer could count as evidence against God, especially if we don't have some kind of other explanation. But I think the more non-resistant non-belief, the better that evidence is. And I like deductive arguments. I think they're helpful, but I think sometimes they miss this idea that concepts often do come in degrees, and we should be sensitive to that and realize that evidence against God isn't all created equal. Sometimes it's much better evidence, and sometimes it's weaker. So that's kind of the thought, and I guess too, like, I think this kind of came out when I gave the problem of evil analogy. The thought is like, look, one non-resistant non-believer, I think makes it much easier to give some kind of like greater goods defense, like maybe God just had a reason, a really good reason, and there was some greater good there, or a skeptical theist defense, or whatever. So I think even if there was only one, there's less of a burden on these like other responses that you might give to the problem of divine hiddenness.
Yeah, I think I'm inclined to agree. Like, okay, it is a deductive argument, but the strength of the deductive argument depends on the strengths of the premises. And
yeah,
like one of the premises involved is that God wouldn't allow or wouldn't permit the sort of non-resistant non-belief. But that becomes maybe an easier premise to deny if there's less non-resistant non-belief.
Yeah,
is maybe the point.
I think that's clearly the case, but I mean, I've been told that Schellenberg doesn't view it that way, so it's kind of interesting. Like, I think I've heard Mike Ray be like, look, like there's one person, that's a non-resistant whole lot. You know what I mean? It does seem like, to me, like those are pretty intuitively different evidential situations. So yeah, I agree.
And speaking of problems, the problem of evil or problems of evil, and this argument of hiddenness and sort of other arguments or concerns people bring up against God, do you think that any of these arguments are particularly concerning, or what do you think is the most serious sort of anti-theistic arguments that give you pause?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I mean, I think for me, the biggest two are the problem of evil and the problem of divine hiddenness. And I kind of go back and forth about which one I'm more worried about. I think when you read about very serious evils, like that gets me worried about the problem of evil. And so I think, periods where, I am really worried about that. I think I take that argument very seriously. I think everyone should. But I think on the other hand, what I've heard people say is like, if there's evil there, but God is evident and God is clear to you and you know that God is there, that feels like a very different situation where maybe there isn't evil, but you feel like God is so far from you. You don't, where is God? Like, I don't understand. Like, why is God not revealing God's self? And so it's almost like if you have evil, but you don't have divine hiddenness, you kind of say, yeah, I don't know why there's evil here, but I know that God is here and there's some kind of explanation. Whereas if you have divine hiddenness, even if you don't have evil, it just seems like you're in a really tough position epistemically. And so, when I get into that mindset, I think I'm more worried about divine hiddenness. So, I know that wasn't necessarily a straight up answer to you. I think on the other hand, one thing that's interesting about divine hiddenness, I mean, there's a debate too about like, is divine hiddenness a species of evil? Maybe some people think evil is a species of divine hiddenness. How do these two problems relate to each other? That's a super interesting debate. But what was I going to say? I just lost my train of thought. I'm sorry. I was talking about like which problem I think is worse. And so I go back and forth between them. How they relate,
yeah.
And how they relate to each other. Yeah, I'm really sorry. I was going to say something about them, and I just oh yes, this is what I was going to say. Yes, good. So so the problem of evil, there's some really bad evils in the world, some really serious evils. And when you try to give this sort of argument like, yeah, they're outweighed by this greater good, I mean, that good has to be really good, right, to outweigh those evils. Like the Holocaust, like you just read stories about people that were just raped and tortured, and even some of these crime shows I've been watching, it's just like, it's horrible, the things that happen to people, right? And so what's interesting about, I think, divine hiddenness is that it's bad in a way, but there's not, at least when I hear about those stories, like, yeah, it's hard and it's sad, and I wish God was more evident to these people, but it's not clear to me that something like a free will defense can't actually do a lot more outweighing work in the case of like divine hiddenness. So for example, Dustin Crummett has defended this view, and I think a few others have, where God is hidden because God wants us to help each other see God. And God wants, like, it's kind of a free will type thing. Like, we have free will to tell other people about God and to help people come to know God. And so that's part of the reason God's hidden, is because God wants to give us sort of this ability to show God to other people, and maybe an ability to make free decisions without God being like right up there in your face. And to me, it seems like one thing that I think is interesting is like that kind of free will like defense. It seems to kind of be able to get more ground when it comes to the problem of divine hiddenness rather than the problem of evil, because when you just only rely on free will to explain evil, it's not clear to me that free will is a good enough good to outweigh all the evils. But I think I can more get on board with this idea. Maybe it is a good enough good to outweigh whatever bad is associated with divine hiddenness. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah, some great points there. I wonder if the sort of intuitive like worseness of the problems of evil comes from the fact that, look, we just have this intense, in so many cases, emotional response to a lot of evils in the world, whereas we have less of a response to sort of non-belief.
Yeah.
Although I wonder if on reflection, it should be the reverse, in that, okay, these evils that we see in the world are quite bad and do appropriately elicit these sorts of responses, but the consequences of non-belief are vastly more significant if they have this different to sort of eternal salvation and punishment and so forth. Maybe that really should be the far more concerning problem if we think about it that way.
No, that's a nice point. I think we often don't attach non-belief to that automatically. So I totally hear what you're saying. And I guess, like, I'll say too, I'm open to the idea that someone can be facing very serious doubt about God's existence, but continue in a commitment to God and be a totally legitimate, legitimately practice of religion sort of without belief. And, too, I don't actually necessarily have a settled view on, like, I know I defend Pascal's wager, but I don't necessarily believe in hell either, So there's a lot of interesting questions like that have to do with your credence in hell. And obviously too, you can get Pascal's wager off the ground even if you have a non-zero credence in hell. And so maybe even that non-zero credence should disturb us quite a bit, even if we don't flat out believe in it or whatever. So yeah, that's a really good point. I hadn't really thought of that. I think hell, if you believe in hell, I guess it could kind of create its own kind of challenge. Like how does that all work? That's not something I've necessarily thought a lot about or done a lot of research on. But that there's a lot of questions about how that could be consistent with a loving and all good God.
All right, and a point that Sensus sort of was brought up in the chat, like, what do we make of the people who, and presumably there are many, lived before a lot of theistic beliefs were developed, especially as it relates to hiddenness here? I mean, what should we say about those people, or what could be said, do you think?
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question. And I guess it depends on like what you mean by theism, right? There's like a very robust sense of theism. Philosophers arguably make it even more robust than probably like your average churchgoer, where it's like this omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent being, etc., etc. You build all this stuff into it. But it's interesting to think about like at what point people just sort of had a general concept of a creator or of someone they might be held accountable to or something like that, So I do think, like thinking about what does it mean to be a theist and maybe not like having a super thick requirement there, that could have some interesting kind of implications for this question. But I don't necessarily either claim that there are no non-resistant non-believers either. I'm open to the thought that there are, and maybe those are explained by another response to hiddenness. And I think in general, like, in terms of, you asked me like, what are the biggest arguments against God you worry about? And maybe I'll say just like a little bit about responses to those. Like, I think in a lot of cases, the theist would do well to embrace many responses at the same time. That, with the problem of evil, people have suggested free will might be part of the reason, soul building might be part of the reason, skeptical theism might be part of the reason, et cetera, et cetera. And I think the best response is probably one that kind of embraces all of those together. And maybe we don't know exactly which evils are justified by which goods, and then which evils we give more of a skeptical theist response to or whatever. But my sort of tendency there would be to just kind of embrace all those responses at once.
Awesome, great. So I think we'll move on. DE, if you wanted to get in voice, you can ask your questions now.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, yep, hello? Definitely.
Oh, good. All right, yeah, so I was just, when you talk about the problem of evil, are you just talking about the evidential problem of evil? Do you have any concerns about the logical problem of evil?
It's funny you ask about this, because this actually sort of relates to what we were talking about earlier with like putting an argument as deductive versus inductive. And I think honestly, it's like a contingent sociological reason that people make such a fuss about the difference between this. So you're totally right to ask about this. It's not your fault. But I guess I just think, look, we can put arguments in deductive form. That's great. But like ultimately, we're going to be kind of evaluating the premises probabilistically and, probably, applying some probabilistic reasoning, and the premises might boost the probability of the conclusion, but it's not like we're like either assigning each premise 1 or 0 and then either assigning the conclusion 1 or 0. So to me, I guess I don't make a huge fuss about the distinction between the evidential and the logical problem. I mean, I guess if I had to pick, I would go in for more the evidential thing, partially because of the reasons we were talking about earlier, where we need to be sensitive to the fact that like different levels of joint hiddenness would have different evidential weight. And I think in the same way, just, realizing like different amounts of evil would count as evidence against God. And yeah, you can give like this free will thing. That means like the strict deductive argument maybe isn't sound or whatever. But to me, I don't make a huge fuss about the distinction because I actually think this just happens with lots of arguments that yeah, there's going to be like counterexamples that make it not like strictly sound, but then we just look at the probabilities of the premises and evaluate it that way. Does that make sense?
I guess see, there are things that I think I share that intuition for, but I don't really share that intuition for things that are supposed to be known a priori, right? Like if you gave some sort of deductive mathematical proof, for example, I wouldn't, you had a bunch of premises or whatever. Presumably they are verifiable through the axioms, but you'd have confidence in those that was like approaching one. And I think with things like evil or things like I mean, unless you're some sort of naturalist about morality, which I don't really know how anybody could have that view, but. I mean, my point is that with things like ethics and things like evil, it seems like those types of things just have to be sort of like fully fleshed out conceptually. So it's not as if I mean, I don't really know what like take something that's like a primitive good, for example. Like what evidence could you have? What premises does that rest on that would raise the probability that this thing is good or bad or whatever? And so the reason I think it's sort of disanalogous with the case with God is just that I think we have like a concept of like what a moral being is, what an all good being is, and those kinds of things. And so it's from those that I think that you can make those kind of deductions, But the credence in the premises is just like all sort of conceptual, like the conceptual groundwork of whatever your normative ethical theory is or whatever, right? Because I mean, obviously we're assuming moral realism for the sake of argument, but do you see what I'm saying? It's not like you could give the kalam and then but like the second premise of the kalam, you might think that the first premise is a priori sure, whatever, but the second premise you might think, there's things that like I have greater or lesser credence based on this evidence, but I just don't think that when we're talking about concepts of like an all good deity or like that second premise of the kalam, for example,
Yeah, I mean, I think I definitely agree with some of what you're saying. And like, I think your point about mathematical proofs is good. Like that's probably a case where your credence in those theorems or propositions is like 1 or very close to 1, right? But like, I think when it comes to philosophy, like I'm just not going to go around and assign philosophical theories credence 1. Like they're way too controversial. There's like way too many people defending surprising claims. So even the idea like that if God existed, there wouldn't be evil. Like that's not something I'm 100% confident in. And I mean, some people think we shouldn't be 100% confident in anything. I'm actually kind of sympathetic to that view, but it's like the whole point of planning is free will defense is like, right, that even if God is all powerful and all knowing and all good, there could still be evil because free will is a good that outweighs that evil. And again, like I said, I'm not totally convinced that free will is good enough to outweigh all of the evil, but then I think you need to maybe combine that with other greater goods defense and maybe a little bit of skeptical theism in there as well. But sorry, that's kind of getting off of your original question. I guess the main point is like I'm not assigning philosophical theories credence one. I don't know if you were. Maybe you weren't suggesting that, but yeah. Are you there?
All right. Did you want to follow up on that, DE, or do you mind if we move on?
I lost. I lost connection. Am I here? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Oh yeah, sorry, I lost connection. I don't know what happened. I heard like the end of what you were saying was cut off, but I guess the reason I was asking is, because I have this quandary when it comes to things like morally significant freedom, and we can say that, like, I just don't even understand in what sense it's like a greater good if God presumably doesn't have morally significant freedom, right? And so I just wonder, like, why would anybody say that's sort of why I was asking about the logical problem of evil, because when I hear about the free will defense and stuff, I just think, like, to me this doesn't make any sense. God doesn't have morally significant freedom, but he's no lesser because of it, right? And a world with him would not be with only God. Like, presumably if God chose to create nothing, that would not be like a worse world than a world in which there was morally significant freedom. Because then it just sounds like, like the goodness of a world is like parasitic on things that are like apart from God. Like God in and of himself is not wholly good, And so I have these types of concerns, and that's kind of why I was saying the thing about the logical problem, because those are all, to me, those are all kind of conceptual concerns. They don't really, bear on the weight of the evidence.
Yeah, no, I hear you. I think that's a nice challenge. I don't specialize on this, and so I think it's a really nice question. Like, how is, what I think the defender would have to say is, for some reason, morally significant freedom is good for us in a way that it's not good for God. Or, at the very least, most traditional theists would say God couldn't choose evil things. God couldn't do evil. Those would be like impossible worlds where God does evil. And so why is it so valuable for us to be able to choose that if God can't even? And you'd have to give some story there about the difference. I guess I'm not totally convinced you couldn't give a story, but I agree that's a nice question. I would like to learn more about that. But like, I still come back to this thing where, yeah, sure, like there's objections and replies, but the idea that an all good and all powerful and all loving God wouldn't have a good reason to permit evil, I'm just, I'm not going to assign that credence one. So I think that's kind of where I'm coming from. We might not actually disagree if you agree with that, but yeah, I think there's a debate to be had there, and my credences move up and down as I hear various arguments. But it's not something I'm, just like, it's not like 1 + 1 = 2 to me. And I don't even know if I assign credence 1 to 1 + 1 = 2. So does that make sense?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I could talk to you for hours about it, but I'm not going to. So.
Yeah, nice
Awesome.
Questions.
Thanks for that, DE and Liz. So let's see. We had a question from Galileo Figaro, who was wondering about your view on, if you have one, reformed epistemology, where, according to which, we have our it's a sort of proper functionalist view, and God properly designed our minds to track the truth, or more or less be reliable belief-forming mechanisms. And maybe does this sort of undermine itself in that God's mind wasn't designed in that sort of way? So he might not have just one for his beliefs. So I guess, just in general, do you think this is a problem for this view? What do you think about reformed epistemology in general? And maybe do you have any broad epistemological views?
Yeah, nice question. I like it. Yeah. So, interesting objection. Like, if the idea is that what justifies a belief is that it's produced by properly functioning faculties, how could we explain that? God has justified beliefs if God's mind isn't designed. So, one thing you could maybe argue is like there's different senses of proper function, and some of them reference a design plan and others don't. I think Plantinga argues that the only way to make sense of proper function is sort of relative to a design plan, which then kind of gets you theism. But I know many atheist epistemologists that are into the proper functionalism, but would deny that you need a design plan to make sense of proper function. So I think that's one way you could go. I will say I'm not a proper functionalist by any stretch. I don't know if I want to say it's like extremely unlikely, but it's definitely not like on my top couple epistemological views. But yeah, I think that does seem like it definitely seems like a problem for Plantinga's version of proper functionalism. And I'm curious what people say about that. My friend Andrew Moon, I don't know if you know him, but he defends proper functionalism and probably agrees with Plantinga on this. So I would be curious how he would reply to that. But I do think it's not a problem for proper functionalism per se. It's a problem for Plantinga's version where it's relative to a design plan. But that is a nice question. Second question about sensus divinitatis. So the sensus divinitatis is supposed to be a part of our minds that forms beliefs about God. And when it's functioning properly, we form belief in God. So that's how belief in God could be rational without an argument. So you said, can you defend Reformed epistemology without positing a sensus divinitatis? Absolutely, yes, definitely. And actually, Andrew Moon has an article in Philosophy Compass where he talks about this a little bit. But just so maybe just like the basic Reformed epistemology thesis, that is just the idea that belief in God can be rational without it being based on an argument that God exists. And I think that bare claim, I accept that bare claim. And there's a lot of baggage that's associated with Reformed epistemology, proper functionalism, design plans, sensus divinitatis, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that really basic claim is actually consistent with a lot of epistemological theories, including evidentialism and reliabilism and others. And it actually, does not require a sensus divinitatis. I actually think it's probably more natural to posit a sensus divinitatis if you're a proper functionalist, because that would be the relevant faculty that would have to be properly functioning to justify belief in God. But let's say you're an evidentialist, and most evidentialists would think you can have evidence that doesn't take the form of arguments. You could have a seeming that God exists, an experience of God. You could believe in God on the basis of testimony. Believing on the basis of these things doesn't entail that you believe on the basis of an argument. And as long as sometimes people can be rational to believe in God on the basis of these non-argument but evidential things, then Reformed epistemology is correct. So that's one way you could go. In terms of my own view, I don't have a strong, so kind of stepping back a little bit, there's this whole debate in epistemology, internalism versus externalism. And the big thought is, well, we have knowledge. Knowledge is, parts of knowledge are justification, truth, and belief. And then the big question is, how do we analyze justification? What is the correct account? And then two main camps, internalists say what justification amounts to is something that's internally accessible to the agent. Most of them are evidentialists. So they say you're justified when your evidence supports a certain proposition. You're justified to believe it. And then there's externalists. And two of those camps are reliabilists, who say a belief is justified when it's produced by a reliable faculty, and then proper functionalists, who say a belief is justified when it's produced by a properly functioning faculty. And both of these are external views, because the agent doesn't have to be able to access these facts about justification. What justifies is the reliable process or the properly functioning faculty, and those are sort of external to the agent. It's not like evidence that's internally accessible. So my view on this whole debate is actually that both internal things like evidence and external things like reliability are epistemically good. This is William Alston's view. He has a paper called Epistemic Desiderata. I think it's also a book too. I think it's a paper and a book. And he basically says, look, there's just different ways that a belief can be epistemically good. can be supported by evidence. It can be produced by a reliable process. It can be produced by properly functioning faculty. And those are all different epistemic goods that beliefs can have. And I think this is basically right. Like, we want true beliefs. That's a really great thing, but we can't always access the truth. So in some sense, truth is more of an external good because truth depends on the world. But we also want beliefs that are supported by our evidence, and that's more of an internal good, at least insofar as our evidence is accessible to us. So we can believe things that our evidence supports. We can also believe things that are true. We can believe things that are produced by a reliable process. All of these are epistemic goods, and knowledge is cool because it's actually interestingly made up of both, like, potentially internal and external components, although I guess you could debate about to what extent it's internal. I mean, at least it's a belief, and beliefs are often things that are internally accessible for us. And so knowledge kind of arguably combines like some internal and some external epistemic goods. And some people put a lot of weight on knowledge. I don't put as much weight on knowledge in my work. I'm not anti-knowledge, but I just gotten kind of more interested in the question of like what we should believe and then how that interacts with like what credences we should have. But yeah, I don't. But yeah, I think, let a thousand flowers bloom. There's lots of epistemic goods out there. And maybe in some cases we should privilege one over the other. And maybe there is some unique thing that plays this role in justification. But I think even if that's true, that doesn't mean that the other side isn't also getting at something epistemically valuable.
Awesome. That's a great answer. And I think I somewhat agree, except as someone who leans more towards an internalist picture, I tend to think that when we are having discussions about justification and warrant and, arguing in a various like dialectical contexts, what matters for those discussions is the stuff that's accessible to the agent. That's the sort of things that are relevant to attributions of warrant and justification and so forth. And so even if there is some room for talking about external justifiers or external epistemic goods like reliable belief forming mechanisms or whatever, what we're mostly concerned with, or at least what I'm mostly concerned with, is the sort of internal stuff. What do you think about this sort of? Yeah.
No, I hear what you're saying. I mean, like, one reason you might care about epistemology is because you care about what you should believe and you want some kind of action guidance or belief guidance or whatever. And then It does seem like internal stuff is more useful. There's a couple like things to note here, though, that I think are kind of interesting. I mean, the first is that we may not always know what our evidence supports. Arguably sometimes we have evidence that like supports some mathematical theorem, but if we can't prove the theorem, we can't always figure out what our evidence supports. So it might be that even if evidentialism is true, there are still cases where we can't always access what we should believe because it's hard to figure out what our evidence does support. So that's one thing. And then another thing that I think is I guess just useful to think about when we're thinking about what we want from epistemology, like what do we want epistemology to do? I mean, what I was suggesting earlier is that it gives us guidance. It's maybe weird to say action guidance. You could say belief guidance. I don't know exactly how to put it. And I think that's legitimate. But I also think it's interesting to think about evaluative norms. So it's like almost like moving from the first person point of view to like the third person point of view. How would we evaluate like different thinkers, beliefs, credences, or knowledge when we're sort of looking at them from the outside? And I don't necessarily want to say that this can't also be an interesting and valuable project. And even maybe thinking about these evaluative norms that let us evaluate people kind of from the outside, maybe that could then give us some guidance and tell us about the action guiding norms also. So I think there's kind of two legitimate like norms or ways of evaluating people, and both are interesting and both are worth looking into more.
Awesome, great. I wanted to transition to talking about some of your work on belief and credence. It's something that you've written a fair amount on. And you mentioned Andrew Moon, and I guess I'll use that as a segue, because you wrote a paper with him defending, as far as I can tell, a belief first view, even though most of your work, from what I can tell, suggested a sort of dualist picture, that they're sort of distinct cognitive states. One isn't explained or reduced to the other. Is this actually in conflict as I'm interpreting, or is it, where is your view at now in that regard?
Yeah, no, it's a nice question. It is confusing. So I guess maybe a little backstory. I don't know if you care, but whatever. Like what happened. So I was a grad student at Notre Dame. Andrew was actually a postdoc there, and we started a reading group on Belief and Credence. And then we were reading through a bunch of literature, and just to kind of get people up to speed, there's pretty much three main views. There's beliefs, belief withholding disbelief, credences. You can have a bunch of credences on a scale from 0 to 1. And then the big question is, does one reduce to the other? And so belief firsters say beliefs are fundamental, credences reduce to beliefs. Credence firsters say credences are fundamental, beliefs reduce to credences. And then my view is the view that we have both beliefs and credences and they don't reduce to each other. So I was kind of into this view. Andrew loves a belief first view. He loves this idea that credence is reduced to beliefs. But as we were reading this literature in this reading group together, we were both just like, dude, like people like mention the belief first view in like a paragraph at most, give some quick like hand wavy objection, and then just brush it aside. Like people are not giving this view time of day, and they're not taking it seriously. And so separately, Andrew had a paper defending the belief first view, and then I had a chapter in my dissertation where I was like, look, I don't ultimately hold this view, but like some of these objections are not as good as people think they are, and people need to at least take this view more seriously, like think more about it, guys. And so then we ended up being like, well, we both kind of have like half a paper here, so let's just put our papers together and then like write a paper defending the belief first view. I know it's kind of weird because that's not actually my view, and there's actually a footnote in the paper that says one of us holds this view, the other is a dualist. So it's not, another like interesting philosophical question is like, to what extent is it okay to defend views that you don't hold? And I guess I take like our thesis in that paper to be a little bit weaker, like some of these objections to the belief first view fail or something. And I do hold that thesis, but yeah, I don't actually hold the belief first view. But you're not the first person to kind of be confused by that.
Yeah, and you bring up an interesting point there about, well, I mean, at least question about, well, to what extent should we defend or promote views that we don't in fact hold? And it seems to me, obviously, there's going to be some place for that if we think that, okay, a view is false, but it's in some sense underrepresented or too quickly dismissed. Maybe having a more conversation about that will benefit the literature, even if you ultimately think that it's false. I think there has to be some sort of room for that. Yeah.
Yep, totally. I mean, there's also like I'm working on a paper on this now, actually. What attitude do we take to our favorite philosophical views? And a lot of people think it's not belief. A lot of people think it's more like championing or accepting or endorsing or something. And what we do is we kind of endorse a view. We sort of see how far we can take it, but we don't actually believe it. And people think this because there's just way too much disagreement in philosophy for it to be rational to believe our theories. I don't actually hold that view, but I do think it's interesting. And I think I do think sometimes, even if we can believe our philosophical theories in a lot of cases, I don't think it's like irrational to believe them. I think sometimes it's totally appropriate to champion a view or accept a view, is how some people would put it, even if you don't believe it, kind of just for the sake of epistemically improving the group,
Yeah, you had I think a video on your channel that I watched where you're discussing this paper or some of the views in there, and it made me think of like what Graham Oppes does when he's developing his view about there's this necessary initial starting point and then this chancy evolution. But when people have asked him, including on this platform, whether he really believes it, that's kind of another question. It's like something he's taken as a sort of to have a view to defend or have a place in the conversation and so forth. But it may not be something that he really believes, right? And so maybe there is some room for that.
Yeah, totally. I think like my main like shtick in the video you're talking about is At least in a lot of cases, I don't think it's strictly, irrational to believe the views that we hold, and I kind of give some arguments for that there. But I also think at the same time, it can be totally appropriate to defend views that you don't hold, and it is interesting to spend your career defending something, but not actually believe it. And sometimes I'm like, I get worried about that a little bit. I'm like, so then are we all just like playing this game, or like just defending a view, But I do think like you can do that to epistemically help out the group, like I said. So I think that's a good reason to do it. But yeah, it's an interesting question in and of itself, I think.
All right. And so I actually wanted to get your thoughts on a potential objection that I had to one of your arguments for the dualist view that you present in at least one paper, and I think it also comes up in your dissertation, though I didn't read the whole dissertation.
Wow, you didn't read my whole dissertation? No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
As an aside, I wanted to mention that it's awesome that you on your website have all these links to like the fill paper sites for these papers, including your dissertation, where you can just download them off fill paper. So that was really helpful.
Oh yeah.
I
don't know why everyone doesn't do that, because it's like, if people want to read your stuff, why would you write it if you don't want people to read? I don't know. Yeah.
Exactly.
Anyway.
But yeah, so you have this argument based on like just graspable propositions but look, okay, there's some propositions that are so complicated, or that we're not quite sure what they're saying, but we can just grasp them enough to form some belief about them, but not enough so that we could form any more complicated belief about that proposition, including any belief about the likelihood of that proposition. And if the belief first view is correct, then the credence, having a particular credence about that proposition, just would require forming a more complex belief about that proposition. But by hypothesis, we can't, and so we couldn't form a credence about that proposition on the belief first view. But on the other hand, plausibly, we can have credence about that belief, which about that proposition, which suggests that the credence isn't another sort of belief. Is that sort of correct characterization of the line of argument?
Yeah, so this is my objection to the view that Andrew and I defended together. So yeah, but yeah, that's correct.
Awesome. So I wonder how to state this well. I wonder if the following sort of objection makes any sense. Someone might grant that the further proposition, the modal term added to the proposition itself, is propositionally more complex, but the act of believing it might not be cognitively more complex necessarily. In that, and we might think this is true in every case, in the following sort of way. I can form this sort of complex thought or about some complex proposition that I just barely grasp and think that it's true. But then I can also just think, of that belief that I'm having, I think it's this likely to be true. And in a way, I'm believing a more complex proposition. But cognitively speaking, mentally speaking, it's simpler, or at least at the very least, it needn't be more complex, because I'm not really thinking about the details of the complex proposition. I'm just kind of pointing at the belief that I'm having. And maybe this is possible in every case, and maybe that's can explain how we develop credences in those cases on a belief first view. Does the objection make any sense?
Yeah, I know. It's like, I mean, maybe this isn't exactly what you were saying, but like one way you might object is like this labeling thing, like give me this really complicated proposition and then like call it P and then believe probably P. Right. Is that, or is it more than that? I want to make sure I get it right.
Yeah. So the point is that in believing, there's different ways that we can believe in P. One is to sort of think about all of the details of some complicated proposition. But another is to think about, a belief that we're having about that is P, that has its content as P. And in thinking about that belief, we may not have to fully grasp all the content of the proposition. Or the content of that belief, which is the proposition. And so I can think that my
Mhm.
belief is true, that belief which has as its content that proposition. But this second belief about the likelihood that that belief is true is in a way cognitively less complex than the initial belief,
Mhm.
or at least needn't be more complex. I don't know, maybe
Yeah.
that's not a better
So
explanation. But
no. I mean, yeah, maybe I'll answer and you can like tell me if it helps. So, like, here's the thought. So we start with this idea that at least some propositions are not graspable for some person, let's say. Some propositions are too complex for that person to grasp. And then my worry is that if this is actually a legitimate way of grasping the modal or probabilistic proposition, you can just iterate this process such that you could like grasp any proposition by calling some proposition P and then adding onto it, whether that's with a disjunction or conjunction or modal operator or whatever. And I think like at a certain point, if you like iterate this process, you're just not going to be actually grasping the proposition in question. And yeah, I mean, I think when you grasp a proposition and then form an attitude towards it, philosophers tell a story about what it means. Like, let's just say you grasp a proposition and you believe it. Well, you encode that proposition in your mental life in a certain way. A lot of philosophers think that it would result in certain behavioral dispositions. You represent the world as if that thing is true, et cetera, et cetera. And so the worry is that if you just like are like embedding these labeled propositions like in more and more complex things, like at a certain point you're just not going to meet those criteria for grasping or forming an attitude about that proposition at all. And if you really think this is legitimate, I think you can just like iterate this process to the point where you can literally grasp anything, and that seems like a reductio to me. Does that answer your question?
oh, that yeah, gee, there's an interesting point there. So like this sort of other example popped into my mind that might be an objection to what I'm saying, and maybe it's a sort of thing that you might be thinking about. Maybe if what I'm saying is right, I could form a credence about, say, someone else's belief, and in that I could think, well, probably what you're believing right now is true, or suppose I thought that, but I could do that without knowing at all what you're thinking about right now. Does that count as really a belief about that proposition that you're thinking? If you are thinking, have really grasped it? I guess, I mean, obviously not, since I'm not really in any way aware of the proposition. Of course, in a sense, I still have this sort of credence or belief about that proposition. But yeah, so I guess maybe it's going to turn on what's really required here, whether you need to grasp it or not, and to what extent.
Yeah, well, it's almost like a, is it like a de dicto de re distinction or something? It's like, in some sense, you have an attitude towards the thing, but you're not actually grasping what is said, arguably, right? So you kind of grasp it, what would it be, de re, but not de dicto? And then maybe the thought would be that you need to grasp it de dicto in order to actually like form a credence in it or something. I kind of did that on the fly, but does that sound right?
No. Yeah, I understand the point. Yeah, that makes sense. I guess there's some more to explore there, but
yeah, no, it's a nice objection. I think like in that paper, I like had it in there initially, and I think it like maybe like a younger cousin of it is still in there, but a referee maybe like combine a bunch of objections into one, and so I don't know if it's like still clearly in the paper. So it was an objection I had initially had in the paper. I'm trying to remember how clearly it's still in there, but it's a really nice objection.
Yeah, but I guess the general form of the objection is that, okay, even if we grant that it's propositionally more complex, maybe there's some way, maybe not the way that I suggested, but maybe some way in every case to make it cognitively less complex such that the person could affirm it.
Well, and I think this is different than the labeling thing. Like, you can express the same proposition with different sentences, right? And there's ways to express a proposition. This is like teaching, right? Like, and make it so the students can grasp it you express it in like a simple sentence and give an example or whatever, or you can express the same proposition in like a very complex way, using different words, but trying to express the same idea, and then it's like very difficult to grasp, right? And so, yeah, I mean, I definitely grant that it could be propositionally more or less complex propositions, but depending on like the context and how they're expressed, it could be more or less cognitively difficult or easy to grasp them. But I think like the thought is like, look, like, yeah, I think that's legitimate. That's like a strategy you can use to make certain propositions that were once very difficult to graspable. But the point is, like, even if you do that, there's still going to be some line at which like a proposition is just not graspable for you at all, no matter what words you use to express it or how you explain it. At least that's the thought. If you think some propositions are not graspable for us, and so I think there is going to be a point at which cognitively you can't grasp a proposition, like, no matter how it's expressed. So as long as I think there is a line there, I think that's all I need.
Awesome. Yeah, some good arguments and points there. Great.
Yeah, no, it's kind of a weird topic, but yeah, no, it's fun too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So actually, I had a more general concern or worry that I wonder if you had any sympathy to. That's sort of a meta point. We might think that, I mean, it's very clearly true that, in my opinion at least, our cognitive lives are in a way far more complex and messy than a lot of this relatively simple theorizing might seem to let on. And you think that maybe that suggests that maybe we shouldn't take these disputes too seriously? Does that sort of undermine a lot of these disputes? Okay, what is it really? Is the belief really this sort of thing? Or that maybe we're not doing justice to a lot of the complex underlying cognitive processes that are really going on? You kind of understand the worry there.
Yeah, I mean, so I want you to push back. So I'm going to say something, but then like say more. So this is what I was thinking when you were saying that. Like, this is a great reason to like be a dualist and stop trying to like reduce stuff to stuff. Like, we have these complex, messy lives. Sometimes we reason and treat propositions as flat out true, and other times we have various levels of confidence in them, and we can be modeled as having various credences. And it's like these people just try to say it's all just probability beliefs or it's all just credences, and it's like, no, like, we have complex and messy lives, cognitive lives, and you're just being like way too quick to try to reduce things and not realize, like, it's interesting, like simplicity. Like, a lot of people are into simplicity and metaphysics and think like, yeah, we should prefer the simple theory, blah blah blah. But it's not clear to me that when we're trying to figure out like what mental states we have, that's even a desiderata. I mean, maybe it is, like, I don't know, but it's, to me, it's not as clear as it is with other cases. Maybe like two scientific theories, we should prefer the simple one. But given what you said, I think that's a great argument for my view. So tell me why I'm wrong about that, or if I'm wrong about that. I don't know.
Well, no, that's great. But the concern might be that the worry is even greater in that, like, there may just, like, these are different ways we're choosing to carve up a highly complicated sort of cognitive space, so to speak. And we could carve it up one way or another way, and maybe there is no fact of the matter about which one is the right way to carve it up, so to speak.
That's nice. Yeah, no. So there is a paper by Jennifer Carr. Sorry, I'm like Googling stuff so I can try to like, the paper that basically argues for this view in the context of belief and credence, even, which is really cool. Crap. Okay, finally found her website. Let me tell you the name of it in case you're interested. Subjective probability and the content attitude distinction. So I mean, I don't know if this is exactly what you were talking about, but she's like, look, there's different ways of representing people and what's going on in their heads. And, we have different theories and we argue, can we reduce credence to probability beliefs or not? And she's just kind of like, people are making a lot of fuss about the distinction between contents and attitudes. And really, we just need to I don't know, she's just not a fan of it. She just thinks, look, there's different ways to measure what is going on in people's heads in the same way that my desk is 3 feet long or a meter long or whatever, And so her view is basically just there's different ways to measure these things, but there's not, maybe this isn't exactly the view you were saying, but it reminded me of it. She doesn't really think there's an objective fact of the matter. She just thinks there's sort of different ways to represent people. I don't know if that's what you were getting at, but I think you might like the paper. So I don't know.
Yeah, that is sort of the basic worry that might be right. Like there is no correct approach. I mean, maybe there's certain commitments we have already, sort of conceptually, and how we want to carve up things, but beyond that, maybe there's just no right way to do it, and that some of these approaches might be correct. They just carve it up in different ways.
Yeah, I think that's super, super interesting. I think it's probably wrong, but I think it's super interesting. I think there's almost like a meta-philosophical question here, which is what are we doing when we're positing mental states to people, and what is this whole philosophy of mind business all about? I would like to think we really do have beliefs and there really is a content attitude distinction, but I think her view is super interesting and inspired by some of these more anti-realist views in philosophy of mind. So yeah, I guess that's my take on it. Is I don't have a knockdown argument for it, because I do think for me it's more of a starting point that there is a content attitude distinction. But I think it's interesting and I want to learn more about it, and I think it's definitely worth exploring more.
Awesome. So let's see, another paper of yours. Another paper of yours, you discuss what you call intrapersonal belief permissivism.
Nice.
I guess this is a little bit of a specific and to most people kind of obscure thing to get into, but I thought the argument here was good and correct. I mean, I'm probably adopt more permissive assumptions than your argument requires. So I'm going to read your conclusion anyway. But I wonder if by admitting that there are some cases where we aren't rationally required to do what an ideally rational agent would do, just already sets the stage for the possibility of epistemic supererogation, in that given some body of evidence we have, we can do what's rationally required, or we could do otherwise and approach which rationally ideal or something like that. And sometimes going beyond what's rationally required will, even with the same evidence, lead to different conclusions. And if those are both rationally permissible, then your conclusion just follows straightforwardly, right? And we can, I guess, give examples. I guess this is the sort of way you argue for it, but it's the fact that we aren't required rationally to do what's rationally ideal is sort of what's doing most of the work there. I think that's kind of right.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think I talk about this a little bit in that paper, but the idea is that rationality is what you might call a satisficing norm. It's not a norm that requires the most of us. It's a norm that requires something of us, but we can go beyond it and be even more rational. And yeah, I do think that is doing quite a bit of the work, at least in that part of the argument. And I do think people might deny this, depending on your view of rationality. And some people think rationality really is just ideal rationality, but then you can be more or less rational. So Julia Staffel has this book called Unsettled Thoughts. I actually just wrote a review of it, and that's kind of her whole point of her book, is to try to give us a story about what it would mean to be more or less rational, even if we can't be ideally rational. So, at least some Bayesians, I think, would disagree with this view of rationality, and they would say that they're kind of ideally rational or you're not. But then Julia is trying to kind of step in and say, well, look, you can be more or less rational. You could like have more or less coherent credences. You could, update by conditionalization all the time except for once, or never update by, you know what I mean? So she's kind of trying to step in and say there's some middle ground here. But yeah, I guess I'm not convinced that rationality is this maximizing norm. I think it is a satisficing norm, but I do think that would be controversial, at least among some epistemologists too. So that might be the way that the impermissivist would get out of it, is try to say the person who has done something that is epistemically good but not epistemically ideal, they would probably try to say that they're irrational, but they're less irrational than the person that, is just not done anything epistemically good at all. So yeah, I think that's what they would say. I like how like you're defending my view and then I'm like objecting to it now.
No, that all makes perfect sense to me. Like in that, look, we have various commitments to all sorts of epistemic norms, and it just seems that the maximizing norms, I mean, we could be committed to those and then maybe faulted for failing to live up to them in light of those commitments. But those aren't going to be very useful to us. We're not ideal agents. We don't behave in that sort of way. It's not going to be useful in our everyday limited deliberation and decision making. So why would be required to go beyond and perform those sorts of actions?
We're kind of coming back around to the like evaluative versus action guiding thing we were talking about earlier a little bit. But no, I hear you. I mean, and here's a really boring way to settle the debate. You could say permissivists are interested in one strand of rationality and impermissivists are interested in another strand. Like that is, you could say that, and some people might want to say that. I think that's kind of boring, but that is a way you could go. You could say you're rational in this one more useful action guiding sense, but not rational in this other more ideal evaluative sense. I think I would ultimately want to try to resist that in some way and try to argue there's some notion of rationality that we're actually genuinely disagreeing about, but someone could try to take that line.
Awesome. And assuming we're still good for time, I wanted to briefly ask about, you have another paper discussing belief, hope, and faith, which I found kind of interesting. And I was wondering if you talk about the conative components to hope and faith, and how I forget which one has a greater
hope.
Hope has the greater conative component to it.
Yep.
I was wondering though if necessarily that has to be right. In that plausibly, I don't know. I have these sorts of attitudes where it seems like it's appropriate to call it a sort of hope, but it's not sort of hope. That would be necessarily action guiding or something like that. Like I might say, I hope that there's, I don't know, world peace, or I hope that this particular mathematical theorem is true. But that's not going to really feature into my guiding my actions necessarily, right? Does that make sense, or does that not really a hope? Or
Nice. So here's one distinction that might help, and I do mention this briefly in the paper, but some people in the hope literature distinguish, and I don't know if this is exactly what you're getting at, but it might at least help, between what's called like prosaic hopes and mundane hopes. So prosaic hopes are hopes that are central to our life commitments and central to our goals, and it would be like the person stuck in the concentration camp hope that they'll get out, or you're going through like a really serious illness, your hope that you recover, or your hope that your son stops doing whatever bad thing he's doing, whatever, so these hopes that are like these really central, like important hopes. Then there's hopes that are like these mundane hopes. So hopes like, I hope that my picnic doesn't get rained out tomorrow, or I hope my cousin gets the job he applied for, or whatever. And so the thought is like, these mundane hopes, that is not the kind of hope I'm thinking about in this paper. I'm thinking about these hopes that are sort of tied up with and central to our life commitments. And so these are the hopes that are going to have this stronger conative component, as opposed to like, your vague hope that your cousin gets his job, right? So I think we use the word hope to kind of refer to both, but I think this is kind of an important distinction between these like life-shaping, commitment-orienting, super profound hopes, and then just the mundane kind of like, I hope whatever. So yeah, I think that's sort of where I would go on that. I mean, there's also interesting, like you said, like I hope for world peace, but like I'm not really that like invested in it. That's an interesting case because it does kind of seem like it could be a really important hope, but it's not like you're not really centering your life around it. So, but you would admit that it's a really important thing. And maybe in some sense you still have a really strong desire for it. So I might actually just say like, maybe that's something maybe you should center your life around a little bit more. But maybe it's just a case where you have a strong desire for something, but you're not acting on the strongest desire. So you're like weak-willed or something. Yeah, I don't know. It is kind of interesting. These like, I hope like global warming doesn't like take off and destroy us, but like I'm not doing a lot about that. Maybe I'm just irrational. I don't know. But yeah, I would say at least in some of those cases, maybe you do have the strong desire, but you're just not acting on it. But you should act on it.
Fair enough. What about the other sort of example where you, I really hope that, say, I don't know, Goldbach's conjecture is true, and maybe the truth of Goldbach's conjecture is really important to you. Maybe your work as a mathematician that relies, and a lot of your work relies on the truth of that, or something like that. But presumably you're not going to be able to make it true. I mean, you could try to prove it, but it's not your proof that's like making it true.
Oh, yeah. No, I agree with that. I was just thinking, like either, okay, so you hope that Goldbach's conjecture is true. I think either that's going to fall into one of two categories. Like either it's going to be like a more mundane hope where you're like, I hope this is true, but it's kind of just like, it would be really cool and fun and like give me an extra publication, whatever. And then I'm going to say, well, then that's like not the hope I'm focusing on in the paper. So yeah, that might be a case where your desire isn't as strong as it, that doesn't have the greater conative component, but that's not my focus. But it's like your life's projects and your life's work are like centered around this conjecture being true. And like if you proved it, it would just like change your entire life and give you tenure and whatever. Then I would say maybe you do have that greater conative component. Maybe that is like this central life commitment, this important life project for you. And so then you do have that really, really strong desire associated with it. And it would be like a profound hope as opposed to like a mundane hope. So
right.
Yeah.
Although yeah, absolutely. Although I think specifically, I mean, plausibly they could have their desire or hope could just be about it being true, not necessarily that they're like it's being proved or something like that. Right? That maybe that we could just entangle those. Right?
Yeah, I'm trying to get so sense. It's just like maybe, it's maybe like a weird desire. Certain math nerds like have this like phenomenological experience that I don't have. I'm like thinking like, do I have this with any like philosophy thing? Like I actually randomly, I love like impossible worlds. I think they're super cool. So I hope there are impossible worlds. So maybe I can, maybe that would be like the example that, because it's not like it's like with God's existence, it's like that has all these implications and whatever. So I'm trying to think of something that's like more abstract, So like I hope there are impossible worlds. Yeah, no, that's kind of an interesting case. So like you really, really hope it's true, but well, and so what would the claim be? Just like you don't have as strong of a desire?
It's not like you have some desire to like make it true, or maybe you don't even have a desire to show that it's true. Your desire is just about it being true, perhaps.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, like this is like maybe sort of a cop-out, but like I guess another thing in the paper is like I wasn't necessarily saying that every case, like what I was trying to do was say like, look, when you have a commitment to something and you either like lose counter evidence or you like lose desire, here's a way that you could be rational to continue in that commitment, even though you're sort of like losing one of the two like fundamental things that upholds that commitment. You know, you either go belief, faith, hope, or maybe faith, hope, belief, or whatever. You can like trace this path, right? But I guess it's open to my argument that not all hopes like rationalize actions. Maybe like many do, especially the profound hopes. But I definitely think, I mean, I don't know. Do I want to say this is just a mundane hope? Maybe. I don't know. And so what you're trying to push is it's not a mundane hope, but you're not going to act on it in any way. That's sort of the thought.
All right, fair enough. And just on,
I don't know. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't really give a good answer to that one.
No.
It's a nice case. I want to think more about it.
Fair.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And just this might be a slightly more personal question, so you don't have to answer it if you don't want to. But when it comes to some of these issues like hope and faith, have you incorporated some of the conclusions you've drawn into your everyday life, including like the faith that you have?
Yeah, I love that question. No, great. Absolutely. I definitely think so. I mean, I think, you know, I grew up like a religious person. I think a lot of these conclusions apply beyond religion as well. But I think for me, it's like we talked about at the beginning of the interview, like I really try to take the problem of evil seriously. I try to not just like brush it off. Same with the problem of divine hiddenness, you know? And I think a lot of my work on faith and hope, and even on Pascal's wager, has really enabled me to see that I can take that seriously and I can like lower my credence accordingly, but nonetheless like be rational in my religious commitment, for example. I think this could apply outside of religion as well. It could apply to, you know, other important commitments we have, whether it's, you know, like a commitment to pick up a new instrument or get in shape or finish grad school, or a commitment to like a friend or a spouse. I think you know, there's a lot of non-religious cases where I think this could work as well. But yeah, I think a lot of people like see a little bit of counter evidence and get really scared and then think that they just like have to burn it all down. And I'm like, no. I mean, maybe this is like a theme of our interview. It's like, look, you got to look at it as like this more degreed thing. Maybe you move your credence down a little bit, but you don't have to just like give up your belief just because you encounter a little bit of counter evidence. And then even more, you don't have to give up your commitment just because you give up some relevant belief. I mean, it depends on the situation, right? And you want to be careful too. Like if you're in a situation where the stakes are really high, if you're wrong, then you might want to give up that belief sooner. You know, you could think about a case like someone in an abusive relationship. You wouldn't want them to continue in that commitment. But that's, I think, why it's really important to be considering this possibility. Like, well, what if I'm wrong about this person? Or what if, you know, if you're experiencing abuse, I mean, you're just in a really tough situation if you're there, but I wouldn't want to say that person should continue in that commitment. So it's not that we should continue in all commitments no matter what. I definitely think that's not the case, but I do think people get really scared of counter evidence, maybe too scared. And I think in a lot of cases, it's really appropriate to continue in our commitments, even in light of counter evidence. And that's a big part of what I think faith is, and the role that faith plays in our relationships and in our commitments.
Awesome. Yeah, really interesting stuff. Yeah, that was discussed in that paper, and I think elsewhere. I'm trying to remember. But yeah, we've been going for a while, and I think I want to have sort of one last kind of general question, and then we'll wrap up if that's all right with you.
Sure. Yeah.
So this is more of a kind of general metaphilosophical question. It's kind of a really big one, but you can answer it however you like. I was wondering what you think sort of the goal and the general value of philosophy is. What is it that philosophy is kind of aimed at, and what makes philosophy valuable, at least to you?
Yeah, I love that question. I'm going to give an answer, and I think it might be sort of in light of, I've been teaching critical thinking to my students, and this is something I really try to emphasize to them, but I think it's really important. And that's just the value of finding the truth and really focusing on the truth. And I think, especially when it comes to like hot button issues, a lot of them are philosophical, like the morality of abortion, the existence of God, et cetera, et cetera. Things can get really heated in our society. Things can get really polarized. We've seen a lot of like political disagreement, a lot of political polarization, echo chambers, et cetera, et cetera. And I think if we just kind of step back and say, well, like, what is my goal in all of this? Like, what is the point of asking these questions about religion or morality or politics or epistemology or whatever? It's because we want to know the truth about these things. And philosophy, the truth, it's hard. And I think that can be discouraging and make it difficult and make us kind of like lose our focus and think about other things. And so I think it's really important that we kind of come back to that goal. And instead of, we're in a discussion with someone, maybe we disagree, instead of like trying to make ourselves look good and make them look bad, or instead of trying to win a debate, I think like focus on what you can learn from them, focus on ways that you can use that discussion to get closer to the truth. And that, part of that is like a willing to admit you're wrong, willing to admit if there's good arguments for the other side. But I think a lot of philosophers I know, one thing I really like about them is they really do share this concern for truth. And I think that's one reason why, at least in my opinion, not always, but a lot of cases, philosophers do tend to disagree pretty well and tend to say, like, I need to think more about that, tend to kind of admit when they're wrong. Not always, of course, but I do think maybe they're slightly better than like the general population about this. So yeah, I think I would encourage everyone to kind of go out and seek truth and make that your focus and make that your goal.
Excellent. So with that, I'll just we'll end the questions here. I'd like to thank you so much again for coming on. This has been absolutely a pleasure to have you and to talk for so long and for you to answer these questions. It's been great.
Yeah, thank you so much for all your amazing questions about my papers. You were joking about my dissertation, but you've read so much of my work. I'm really, really honored. So thanks for engaging with my stuff. That's really awesome. And thanks to everyone else too for all your questions as well.